We are not waiting. It's a mantra we hear a lot in the open source diabetes community. Heck, it's even a hashtag. What it means is we're not going to wait for big pharma and regulators to make the tech we need. We're going to do it ourselves, and we're going to do it faster. Today, I'm speaking with the person who first uttered those words that reverberated through the community, and his current endeavors to work with regulators to introduce simulations as a standard to speed up diabetes tech innovations. Welcome to the show. I'm Justin. I have type 1 diabetes, and on here, I talk all things diabetes tech news and research with industry leaders, experts, and those using the tech themselves. Today, I'm joined by Lane Desborough. He's very well known in the space. He's a chemical engineer by trade whose job was to build and monitor refinery control loops. When his son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 2009, he quickly pivoted toward using his skills to build solutions that can help people with diabetes. He went on to become the chief engineer at Medtronic and simultaneously was experimenting with remote monitoring for continuous glucose monitors as co-founder of Nightscout, a platform where people could sync their CGMs and their pump data, and eventually it led to allowing people to automate insulin delivery with pumps. Years before FDA-cleared pumps gained that ability. Today, Lane and I go through his journey in the diabetes space, what control loops are, how we interact with them day to day, and his pharma by day and his open source by night endeavors, and his current work to build these simulations that could one day be used to speed up the review process for diabetes technology. The future of diabetes tech could mean innovations as quickly as we get them with phones, and that's what we get into today. Keep in mind that anything you hear on this show is not medical advice and is for educational purposes only. Always consult with your medical team before making changes to your healthcare. Let's get into it. Lane, welcome to the show. It's good to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Justin.
Of course, I have heard your name thrown around so many times through all of my reporting and my digging into the history of diabetes and specifically the open source community. And I'm just so glad to finally have you here to share some of your story. I mean, there's so much to your story. Kind of just start with your background, because that plays a huge role in what you've done for the diabetes community with your work, right? So you come from a background in engineering and nursing from your parents, and that kind of led you to become a chemical engineer, and you focused on computer control systems. Tell us a little bit about what that part of your career looked like.
Sure. So I was fortunate to be exposed to computers back before computers were really a thing, early in the late 70s, actually, early 80s. And I knew that I wanted to incorporate computers into my chemical engineering journey, and you're allowed to specialize when you're going through a course like chemical engineering, and I chose to specialize in this thing called process control. And if you think about a chemical plant or an oil refinery, which is a bunch of pipes and furnaces and distillation columns and compressors and pumps and stuff, those need to be controlled. And in the olden days, they were controlled by humans. So a human would look at a dial, and if the pressure was high or low, he'd make a little change to a valve. Well, that's all done with computers now, because humans are, you don't want to put them in harm's way, and these plants are very dangerous. You want to keep everything inside the pipe, because if they get outside the pipes, they explode and kill people, or have dangerous gases and things that kill you. So chemical engineers never want to see the chemicals. And so what we've done over the past 50 years is taken these manual systems and automated them. And the computers are where all of those signals are brought back to a central control room, and engineers like me figure out how to control these various processes. And in a large refinery or chemical plant, there'll be 5,000 of these control loops, and getting them all to work together and getting them to present alarms and displays that are going to be useful to the operators. If you ever watch The Simpsons, Homer Simpson is a control room operator by day. So that's what he does. And I'm the engineer behind the scenes, writing the code and creating the displays and designing the alarm systems that allow Homer Simpson to do his job effectively.
Yeah, it's interesting because even as you talk about that whole career when it comes to like refineries, it also just sounded like diabetes technology and getting these manual devices to automate and work in a way that doesn't kill people, right? And then alarms come up and you need to manage those. You told me that you had written this program, Loop Scout, which would monitor millions of control loops across 800 refineries and chemical plants.
Mm-hmm.
What you also told me was that systems like that are also similar to how an endocrinologist operates. What are those similarities? Why is that?
Sure. So if we go back to this example of a typical oil refinery having 5,000 control loops, that's not dissimilar to the idea of an endocrinologist having a couple thousand patients to manage. So how do you allocate your time? How do you prioritize? How do you get to the crux of what's going on in this short visit that you have with each patient every quarter? So there's this concept of monitoring and diagnosis, and monitoring I think of as the tap on the shoulder to refocus your attention from whatever you were doing before to say, you need to go look at this loop, or you should be chatting with Justin or Hayden or whoever might be having a problem. So the monitoring is the refocusing of attention, and then diagnosis is, okay, how do we work through what might be going on with you? And so that's the parallel that I mean, that what Loop Scout was doing was saying, okay, here's 5,000 loops under your responsibility. You don't have time to go look at all of them one by one. So here's a way to elevate the ones that have the problems, and here's a way to diagnose those problems. There's different ways that a control loop can have a challenge, and that's the parallel that I'm referring to.
Yeah, I was just on a call yesterday with these developers of an app that is working to create easier solutions for healthcare providers so that they can see this huge control panel of control loops, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. In this case, it was a number. They could see, okay, we've got patients who are 7, we've got some 10s, we've got some 3s. And it helps these medical teams kind of get a bigger view on who's doing well, who isn't, and who we need to really focus on. So, it sounds like we really do need this kind of work, and it would really help these offices. So it was a cool conversation.
If you think about in critical care and in an ICU, the nurses station has something like that, right? Because they'll have 10 beds, and they'll have all the devices connected up, looking at heart rate and breathing and stuff, and they'll get a lot. So it's very similar, that context about monitoring and then saying, okay, what do I do once the red light has gone off on patient 3's room?
After our conversation the other day, you kind of opened my eyes to all of the loops that we experience on a day-to-day basis outside of diabetes. Explain to us kind of what is a control loop, the definition of that.
Sure. So I try and keep it very simple. A control loop has four things, 4 elements to it, and the first and most important is the thing you're controlling. So in control engineering, we call them plants. So, your diabetes is actually a plant in the way we think about things. Even if you're doing control on an aircraft, they're all called plants just by convention. And so the plant is the first thing. And then what happens is there's some component that does a sensing of the plant. In the case of diabetes, it would be sensing glucose with a CGM. Then there's another element that feeds into something that decides an action to take, and then there's something that performs the action. In engineering, we call them actuators. They're acting, but we would call it an insulin pump. So sensing, deciding, acting to affect the thing that you're trying to control, which is the plant. Some examples that are in our daily lives, the thermostat. The thermostat is sensing the temperature in the room, and it's deciding whether to turn on a thing that can make it hotter or colder. And then the thing that can make it hotter or colder is performing the action. So your AC kicks on, or the burner in your furnace turns on and uses a little electricity or gas to bring the temperature up to or down to where you want it to be. So that's an example of sensing, deciding, acting. Another example would be your car. If you are on a road trip and you're on a freeway and it's posted limit of 65, but there's some hills and wind and tailwind and crosswind, and you don't want to have to pay attention to avoid getting a ticket, you would turn your cruise controller on. And what it's doing is it's sensing the speed that you're going, deciding what to do with the engine. Do I press on the gas? Do I press on the brake? So sense, decide, act. And even in a car, that's just one of the examples. There's probably 30 different control loops. And that's the loop that we're talking about, is looping from the sensing, deciding, acting to the plant. And then that is having an effect on the plant that is in turn being sensed again. So in a car, there might be 30 of these things. I couldn't even estimate. There's billions of control loops in the world. Aircraft, automatic pilot, autopilots, that's what they do, right? They reduce the burden of the human, which incidentally is another really important point. Why do we even bother doing these control loops? Why do control loops exist? And this is something I was taught in grad school by my supervisor. The reason we even do control is to transfer variability from a place where it hurts to a place where it doesn't hurt as much in order to make a human's job easier. So in the example of a thermostat, we're transferring variability in room temperature to variability in fuel or electricity, because who cares if we use a little more or less natural gas? I just want it to be 70 degrees in my house. Same with a car's cruise control. We're transferring variability in speed to variability in fuel consumption. And in the case of diabetes, the thing we actually care about and don't want to have variability in is blood glucose. And so we're transferring that variability in blood glucose, which hurts us, to variability in insulin delivery. Who cares if I use a little more or less insulin, this hour versus next hour? I just want my blood glucose to be 100.
When I was diagnosed with diabetes, it kind of changed the direction of my life. I was reviewing I was reviewing like consumer technology. I was talking about the cool iPhones and the wearables. And then as soon as I was diagnosed, none of that mattered anymore. And what mattered to me was talking about the diabetes technology, because I knew that that could legitimately help people on a really deep level. And that gave me a passion and a calling. And I know that your son's diagnosis in 2009 changed your direction. How?
How? Well, I think, first of all, it was completely unexpected. We had no family history of diabetes, and I knew a little bit about it in a detached way. One of the colleagues of mine who I worked with at Honeywell on Loop Scout, his son had been diagnosed. And all I knew, I said to Perry, just go do what you need to do. And he disappeared for 6 months. And what was going on, his wife had needle phobia, and so he was going to give his son injections at school every day and managing. And when my son was diagnosed, what led to that diagnosis was not the traditional, frequent urination and drinking. It was other symptoms like weight loss. So he's a lean guy like me, and then one day when he was getting ready for the bath, we realized he's just not. He's emaciated. Yeah. There's some bigger problem. So the next day, my wife took him to the hospital and phoned me up and said, yep, he's got diabetes, which was, we thought cancer or something like that. And didn't realize afterwards what the journey would involve with diabetes. And incidentally, as I was driving to the hospital, the first person I called was Perry to say, we're now part of the club, that we're in the journey, what's going to happen next. And I think this is something that we see in this community all the time, is the incredible support you get from other club members of how it's going to play out.
So you told me you had this moment in your mind. You were said to yourself, I could either help solve the world's energy crisis, or I can make the lives of people with diabetes easier. And you chose the latter.
Exactly. And now I had a cause. It was fun and worthwhile doing oil refinery and chemical plant and power generation and mine control, but this was very personal for us, and I very quickly realized that what we were dealing with was a control loop. And what happens in an endocrine system for somebody who hasn't been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, that's what the endocrine system's doing. It is the control loop. So it's using glucokinase as the sensor, and it's saying, okay, I need to actuate some insulin or some glucagon in order to affect. So that's what's happening before you're diagnosed. And then type 1 comes along and kills the beta cells, and you're no longer able to produce insulin. And so your loop is broken. So this wonderful loop that has been working your entire life to keep your blood glucose at 100 milligrams per deciliter no longer works, and you get to take over control. You're doing manual control until somebody like me comes along to help automate that with a closed loop system.
Now, you started researching a ton. You were looking for answers, I guess, on how the technology worked, and that kind of led you to find that there were a lot of great minds that you knew in the space that were working in this automated insulin space, right? And then you found this conference in San Francisco to go to.
Yeah, so I'm a naturally curious person, and as soon as my son was diagnosed, I started Googling these concepts, and folks fellow chemical engineers who had specialized in process control started to pop up in these searches. Like, I know that guy. And they had independently made this connection of the parallels between control in oil refineries and the like, and diabetes. So I reached out to them, and they said, hey, there's this conference coming up called the Diabetes Technology Meeting. It's not far from where you're living. You should go. So I did, and it was a really remarkable experience for me.
Yeah, so you're there, you're listening to the FDA at the conference. They're talking about automated insulin delivery systems, which had not been seen yet. And you ask them, has the FDA reached out to the FAA or any other related agencies that could help? And they said no. What happened? What was that? What did that look like?
Well, that's when I realized that I might have something that I can help them with, because it hadn't even entered their mind to imagine that there was a body of experience in billions of other control loops that they might be able to leverage, and that their fellow regulators had decades of experience doing. So to their credit, when I asked the question and they said no, the second thing they said was, do you have any names? So I went up afterwards, was like, you need to go talk to this person and that person, let me introduce you to this. So that was one of the things that happened in this conference. The other thing that happened, which was completely serendipitous, I was keen to get my money's worth being just a interested parent in the food line, the buffet for the lunch. The first day I turned to the person behind me. I'm not an extrovert by nature, but I forced myself to be extroverted in this case. And, who are you? And it turned out he was the CTO of Medtronic Diabetes, who my son by that point was using a Medtronic CGM and an insulin pump. And this trial that my son had been in was based on all these Medtronic components. So I started peppering this guy. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? This is the way we do this in the world I come from. And we ended up having lunch together. Then he invited me to the Northridge campus to talk to his staff. And the next thing I know, he hires me. And
that was 8 months. You got hired at Medtronic 8 months after your son's diagnosis.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you also told me, I forgot to mention that, right after your son was diagnosed, you instantly looked for clinical trials. And then he got in a clinical trial for automated insulin delivery.
Exactly. So he was, this was called the Metabolic Control Trial out of Stanford University. The principal investigator, amazing endocrinologist, Dr. Bruce Buckingham, who's pioneered automated insulin delivery systems. So 7 days after diagnosis, my son was in Stanford, he was the fourth person ever, first boy and youngest to go into this trial. where he was connected up to this prototype AID system where the the deciding, was on a laptop. So it was a sensor connected into a laptop with algorithms running on it that was remotely controlling an insulin pump.
This episode is sponsored by Omnipod. As someone with T1D and with an incredibly active lifestyle, it's important for me not to get tied up, especially with tubes on my insulin pump. I love to go swimming, lift weights, and play kickball with friends. And with Omnipod 5, I never have to worry about tubes getting in the way. Plus, not having to disconnect helps me to stay in range during all of my favorite physical activities. That includes sexy time too. See if you're eligible for a 10-day trial by visiting omnipod.com/diabetic. On there, you'll see full safety and risk information and trial terms. That's omnipod.com/diabetic. So when you got to Medtronic, you told me you were called the alien of the future. Why is that?
Yeah, an alien from the future. So It was kind of like this time machine of, here's all this advanced technology that we're using in these other domains that you might find interesting. And that one day I was talking to the president of Medtronic Diabetes and said, there's no way you would ever get somebody like me to come work for this company or a company like this, because honestly, coming here is like going back in a time machine, getting in a time machine and going back 20 years in my career. Like the things
why do you think that was?
Why? That's a good question. Why do I think,
how were they so far behind if there were people like you, it just, no one had the idea yet,
Yeah, I've thought about this. And there's this concept of the environment determines the innovation. So if you live in a hyper-competitive environment, and I think of land animals, like land animals is very competitive. Living on land is a comparatively difficult thing to living in the ocean. Food is in 3 dimensions on the ocean. It's constant temperature. Fish don't have big brains. That's the punchline. And you need a bigger brain to thrive in a So I was coming from these hyper-competitive environments like oil refining, where it's all about how, can you make it for 0.1 cents cheaper than your competitor? And that entire ecosystem was so competitive. And then I come to the medical device world, where basically once you get a therapy into the market, there are huge barriers to competitive entry to do that. And I look at it that kind of slows down the need for innovation. So I'll give you an example. I drive around in a Prius, and when I started working for Medtronic and go out to the parking lot, everybody's got fancy cars. They have fancy cars, and I got a big salary bump when I went to Medtronic. And it was crazy because it was because of these competitive barriers to entry that they could have very high margins and not have to be very innovative. I think for the first 3 years that I was at Medtronic, there were no new products. There were nothing new got launched. In contrast to these other worlds that I'd come from, is like, if we're not iterating and cranking out new stuff, we're going to get our lunch eaten. So that's, I think, why it was maybe why there weren't that many people like me. And also there's this concept of domain-specific languages and exclusionary languages, where people don't realize that what they're doing is not that dissimilar to something in another domain. And this is something that my academic experience taught me, that I shouldn't just be looking in the chemical engineering library. I should be going to the economics library. I should be going to the electrical engineering library. And they'll be using different words for the same thing. But once you realize that it's the same thing, you can harness and basically get in the time machine and start to leverage. And this was not happening in diabetes. And this really frustrated me because I had this urgency. I wanted this closed loop for my son.
Yeah, and you knew what was possible. Your son's already in this study that's working with this technology. I mean, in the 1960s, Dr. Arnold Kadish had a dual hormone pump. Then there was the Biostator not that long after that was automating insulin in hospitals, right? So this technology existed for years, but then you have these companies that just didn't have competition that were comfortable.
So another dimension to this, you have these one-offs like the biostator where it's a nice thing and it's demonstrating a proof of concept. One thing that I differentiate a chemical engineer from a chemist. A chemist does, and this is not meant to be pejorative, and there's a little bit of overlap. It's not black and white like I'm about to say, but I look at chemists, they're doing novel, innovative things. Let's mix these two test tubes together and see what happens. Chemical engineers do that at scale. We do things. Oil refineries are huge. Chemical plants are huge. The chemical plant that I worked in, 6 billion pounds a year of ethylene. So we're not doing test tube level stuff. We're doing scale. How do we do this at scale? And this is one of the challenges that I think we see even today in diabetes technology and academic research is you see these novel concepts that just don't scale. And this is what the actual challenging part is. My belief. It's not the innovation, the aha moment. It's not the first 10,000 people or 200 people using a therapy. It's how do we get that to 1 million people in a safe, effective way?
While at Medtronic, something you learned was kind of what a commercialization pathway looks like for diabetes devices. And I guess you kind of hinted at it with that. How are your eyes open to just the facts of boundaries that maybe existed that you didn't know?
This is the first heavily regulated industry that I worked in. So despite chemical plants and oil refineries doing this incredibly dangerous thing, basically, boiling oil to get it to turn into gasoline or fractionate it, and chemical plants that are making insecticides and all sorts
don't
of
those
scary
need regulation?
And they don't actually. So they don't have much regulation, and they certainly don't have regulation in the areas of control and automation where I spent my time. So this was my first experience with what it's like to be in a regulated environment. And I first want to say I have the most profound respect for our friends at the FDA and other regulators around the world. They are doing a thankless, difficult, underpaid job with tenacity and commitment, and they're trying to ensure that scaling works properly. That something that works in a little clinical study is going to be safe and effective when it gets released widely in a market, and now there's 300,000 people using it. So I have. That was a big aha moment for me, was the role that the regulator plays and just how important that is. And back to the example of the diabetes technology meeting where I had asked them about if they'd reached out to other regulators. It's not like the FDA says, oh, here's a new technology coming. Let's go hire a bunch of regulators who are good at that thing. Like they don't hire prospectively for new technology. And this is actually a challenge with the regulators because now this new technology, or at least new to them, like AID comes along, and they're not organized that way. They've got a sensor group over here, and they've got a pump group over there, and they've got nobody who looks at algorithms, and now you're trying to bring these sense, decide, act together.
So is it the companies, the pharma companies or the med tech companies that are kind of guiding the FDA? Like, hey, there's this new tech coming out. We're going to create some safety precautions and our own type of regulation to make sure this is safe. Here's what we've done. Because, the FDA doesn't necessarily always know how to handle these brand new technologies, right?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of a bootstrapping back and forth. One of the influential things that happened, and it was 2011, under great pressure from what's now called Breakthrough T1D, but was called JDRF at the time, led by my co-founder at Bigfoot Biomedical, Jeffrey Brewer, was this guidance document. So one of the things that the FDA publishes are these things called guidance documents. And a guidance document gives a possible pathway through the law. And it doesn't say, it's not binding on either party. So it doesn't say, if you follow that path, we'll approve your device. And it also doesn't say, this is the only way you could do it. But it gives you some guidance about how to navigate a new thing through the FDA law. And the JDRF essentially forced the FDA to create this document, and they collaborated, and it's called the APDS guidance. You can go Google this today and find it on the FDA website, Artificial Pancreas Device System Guidance. And so that's one of the ways they do this, to sort of collaborate to introduce a new technology. Now, my frustration with that APDS guidance is it was written in 2011 before any AID systems existed. So it was, and it hasn't been updated since. So here we are 14 years later, and it hasn't been updated. And we've learned a lot about what the risks are, what the opportunities are. And unfortunately, those haven't been incorporated in an updated guidance yet.
What was kind of, before you get to chief engineer at Medtronic, what were kind of some of the responsibilities or positions you held while there?
So they created a role for me, the CTO, my boss, called product strategist. So I was tasked with thinking about, put my alien from the future hat on. What are other things that are going on that we could incorporate? And this was when Fitbits were first coming out and starting to look at novel technology like wrist sensor-based heart rate and sweat detection and accelerometers. So I had a whole box of things that were prototypes of what are today commonplace devices. And part of my remit was to consider how might we incorporate some of those other sensors into therapies that would make living with diabetes easier. So that was one of the
with that you realized that battery charge and connection was just, at least at that time, a nightmare with trying to get that to work with diabetes tech.
Bluetooth low energy was just arriving. It was in prototype form, and getting things to pair, and then when the battery ran on this, you had to repair, and it was just a nightmare getting all this to work. And batteries needing to be recharged or drained, and I realized that it actually wasn't going in the right direction. That you're now asking people to wear more stuff, and the therapy's introducing more of a burden, and the vice president of sales referred to it once as the Batman belt of crap. And this idea of having a bunch of sensors was just more stuff on your body that added to your burden, but it didn't really take it away. And that was when I sort of shifted away and lost interest in that.
Yeah, well, one device that you mentioned did reduce burden was the MySentry remote monitor. Now, this was a screen that would display a glucose level. It would connect to someone's continuous glucose monitor, and then it projects those readings. And I mean, this was revolutionary at the time. Parents every night are needing to go check their kids' glucose levels however many times at night. I can only imagine all the anxiety and panic and worry each night that parents experienced. And so this wasn't available yet. And the funny thing is, I saw this. I went to Medtronic headquarters and went down their diabetes hall of technology, and I saw this device. And when they told me what it was, I was like, and this isn't around now? Like, I know there are third-party devices that do this, but like, why don't you have this out now, right? So this wasn't out. They weren't even planning to put it out. You told me that the marketing department said, no, this doesn't work for us. We can't do it. The marketing department. Since when should the marketing department have any say in technology's usefulness for patients? It should be the engineers. It should be the big thinkers, right? But tell us a little bit about like what was going on at that time and kind of your experience with that device.
Sure. So I first learned of this Sentry device through my son's experience at Stanford, because Stanford had a very close relationship with Medtronic, and they were always showing the latest goodies that might be coming. And so I knew about this thing. And one of the my first days on the job, when I joined Medtronic, my boss had one of these MySentries just up on the shelf behind him in his office. And I saw it and I said, well, can I take that home? And and this was literally sitting on the shelf. The engineers had designed it. The marketing folks had said, we have no market research showing this is even an important need to do remote monitoring. And so he let me take it home, and it completely transformed our lived experience, because no longer are we going in 3 times a night to see if Hayden's okay. Now we can, from our bedroom, just glance over and there's his blood glucose, or his estimated glucose value. So that was great for the first 8 months. And then the regulatory folks found out that I had this thing, and they said, well, that's an unapproved medical device. You need to bring it back. And so we did, and it was devastating. It was, when you realize how much you're relying on something like remote monitoring, and then it goes away, this was basically an existential crisis for our family to have to give it back.
Yeah, and then you wrote a letter to the VP of marketing, right? What came of that?
Exactly. Yeah, so we said, basically, this is a transformative technology. I can tell you it is a useful thing to have. And so they commercialized it, and we got serial number 1 in a little ceremony as a thank you for our showing them the way. And so that really started out Medtronic's journey on remote monitoring.
How successful was that device? How well did Medtronic market it? Or, did you hear feedback from, parents using it?
How do I put this politely? They priced it very high. So it was something like $3,000 or $4,000, wasn't covered by insurance, out of pocket. And it had some issues like false positives. So an example would be if it lost connection between kid's bedroom and where it is, it would give an alarm. It would give an alarm saying, I've lost the signal. So rather than sort of giving you a good night's sleep, it would wake you up 3 times a night with these false positives. And then you go and look, and the blood glucose is flat and nothing's going on. So there was another issue. And one of the bloggers who reviewed it wrote something like, it is so bright you could land an aircraft by the light that it's emitting, which is another example of poor context and understanding the context of use of the thing. Like,
also that's what testing would do, right? Or getting that feedback from people. Hey, it's a version 1. Version 1's never going to be what you wanted. Version 2, we added brightness settings, right? Like, exactly. You learn these things. We strengthened the connection, and I'm sure it sounds like to me that there must have been a long gap where this eventually wasn't being sold or wasn't really being used, and people not having access to shared numbers for a span of time.
I was just going to say, the other contextual thing going on here, when continuous glucose monitors were first introduced, they were viewed as high-risk devices and receiving the highest regulatory scrutiny, which is called a Class 3 device. And anything that you connect to a Class 3 device inherits the Class 3-ness. So a remote monitor of a CGM was being held to the same. You need to do a clinical trial, and you need to have a pre-market authorization. And so it was a big lift. So I give credit to Medtronic for doing this, because at the time, CGMs were Class 3. They didn't become Class 2 till 2018, I think.
Wow. Okay. So Medtronic spent a lot of money to ultimately get this MySentry to be approved.
Yes.
Hence, probably the very expensive price tag. And that's interesting that, I guess they assumed if the device that's getting these readings is inaccurate and a parent gives their kid insulin, but that connection was wrong or something happens, then that is just as important as the CGM at that point.
Yep, absolutely. And this continues today, even with remote monitoring and the ability to create remote monitoring systems in the DIY community. There's sort of a line about, are you giving alarms? Because people become dependent on alarms. And what about the dog that didn't bark? The false positives. What happens if you're now dependent on getting an alarm from something and it doesn't, for whatever reason? It loses connection, or so there's good precedent for this. But I think the DIY community and what became Nightscout helped to shed light on what the real risk and opportunity was. Because before these things existed, it was all anticipated, estimated risk. And then we got to see, having these remote monitoring systems is net positive overall relative to the small risks that we see about missed alarms, for instance.
Yeah, so this MySentry experience, in that period that you didn't have the device, this sparked a new project, right? You decided to build your own. How did you do that?
So I went and got 2 cheap laptops, and being an engineer at Medtronic, I knew all the communications protocols for how to talk to the CGM through the insulin pump. So I wrote a piece of software that just connected 2 laptops in our house over the home network to display my son's blood glucose, and I called it PC Sentry, personal computer Sentry, and I built it over the Christmas holidays in 2010.
And your son, was he wearing the Dexcom G4 at this point? Or was he still on the Guardian or the
He was
Medtronic?
still on whatever it was called at the time. It was before Enlight. Yeah, I guess it was the Guardian.
Okay, gotcha. So this experience of you now building this system, did that spark what would come next, which is Nightscout?
100%. So one of the there'd also been a shift, talking about Alien from the Future, my experience with these oil refinery automation. There'd been this shift in understanding that some of the bad things that were now starting to happen in oil refineries and even before them in cockpits in commercial aviation related to the way that the human and the computer were getting along. Is the autopilot and the pilot, are they on the same page with respect to what's going on with the aircraft? And this is where all the accidents were starting to happen in these other automated industries, which were 20, 30, 50 years ahead of what we were doing with our baby steps in automated insulin delivery. So I was extremely interested in this. How do you design effective user interfaces? How do you design effective alarm systems? So this was also an opportunity for me to express some of those design principles and guidelines, which incidentally, Honeywell has this research center. I was working for Honeywell. They have this research center where they say, okay, we're doing avionics for the 757 and 767, but you know what? There's a human sitting in that cockpit. What are some of the things we can transfer in our insights about that human-computer interaction to oil refinery Homer Simpson control room operators? So this was an opportunity for me to embed some of those principles. One example is minimal use of color. You don't want to have 50 colors on a display, or you don't want to have red meaning 4 different things. Like, these are basic things that just weren't known in my industry that I'd come into medical device industry. So it was an opportunity for me to start to use some of these best practices of effective alarm and display design.
Are you the chief engineer at Medtronic at this point?
Not yet.
Okay, when does that happen?
That happened in 2013, early 2014, I think.
So before that happens, are you already working with John Kostick on Nightscout?
Yes.
Okay. For anyone who doesn't know what Nightscout is this platform that you and John Kostick, you co-founded. It allowed people to bring in pump settings and delivery and CGM readings into one place so you can see these things side by side. This was before we had looping of automated insulin, but this allowed for that as well.
Exactly. So what precipitated that for me was I was given the opportunity, or our family was given the opportunity to try the G4. So here I am working for Medtronic, leading their automated insulin delivery commercialization, leading their design reliability manufacturability initiative, and we have the opportunity to have my son start using the G4, which was great because that's an amazing sensor, but I didn't have all of the back engineering ability to look into that system the way I did. So it didn't work with this PC Sentry thing that I built. So I did what I'm prone to do and went looking for others who might have figured out how to get data off of a G4 so that you could start to put it where you wanted and remotely monitor. And that's when I found John Kostick, and we got together, and he had figured out how to plug into the USB port of the G4's receiver and get real-time information from it. And at the time, I was very interested in how do we move that onto a web service and visualize it in an effective way. So that's really how Nightscout initially came together. Was independent, two engineers, both with sons with type 1 diabetes, knowing that there was really no technical limitation to doing what we felt needed to be done.
So right here is where so many stories that I've told on the podcast are kind of begin to merge, right? So Brandon Arbiter, he's been on the show. He was at this D-Data exchange where you will then be, which we'll briefly talk about. Then you've got Ben West, who is working to crack the Medtronic pump so that he can control it and automate insulin. Then you've got you and John Kostick working to bring all of this information onto a platform that people can then use. Pete Schwam, he's been on the show. He's working on DIY Loop. It's an exciting moment. It's probably one of the most exciting moments in diabetes history since ants were, being attracted by urine, and we were like, oh, you have diabetes. So you're at this D-Data exchange. So many great minds that have come on the show are there, and you believe you went there to talk about Nightscout, and you said these words that reverberated around the entire community and to this day still do, which is "we are not waiting." Tell me about that moment.
I've reflected on this since I uttered those words, and I don't know how or why those words came out of my mouth, but it just seemed to capture, because what had happened, I think there had been 8 different presentations, John Kostick and me and Carmel Allison, and there were a whole bunch of people were doing, Dana Lewis, all these names who were now famous, had done all these interesting things in a DIY hacking kind of way. And when Howard Looks stood up at the whiteboard and said, okay, start throwing concepts of what we've seen here today. And I said, we are not waiting. And I think it captured this idea that this commercial regulatory pathway is slow and burdensome and expensive. And once it's there, it creates these huge barriers to entry. So you're less inclined to innovate because you've got all these protections to, nobody's coming behind you to compete. And we are not waiting is basically saying we're not waiting for the device companies and we're not waiting for the FDA because we have this existential need to leverage and apply this technology. We will take the risk of doing these things, of essentially cracking into medical devices to do what we need to do.
Yeah, you were in a very interesting place because, you would go on to become the chief engineer at Medtronic, and you're going to these conferences and you're talking about DIY, open source, hacking into devices, competitor devices to yours, and using them alongside a Medtronic pump. This is not intended. This sounds so wrong, but so right at the same time. You were, mainstream pharma by day, but open source by night. Were you afraid? Did that even matter to you?
I think this also goes to the example I gave of phoning Perry on the way to the hospital about what's going to happen. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to assert that our first allegiance is to the community. That's, and it creates this huge tension because there's so many people like me who have joined the fight, and joining the fight means going to work for a company. And you're immediately in this conflict of balancing your own personal needs in your community with the things that you need to do and abide by. And so I was also super careful about that. You mentioned Ben West. So Ben's a friend of mine. We've been friends for a long time. Remember the first time we met, we had dinner up in the Bay Area, and it was kind of a scary thing because he was scared of me and I was scared of him because I could watch what was going on. And essentially what was going on is he was reverse engineering the thing that I already had the complete decoder ring sitting on my desk. I knew all of the, it's like, oh, oh, you
You
discovered
couldn't
that
be the
one.
one. Yeah, and you couldn't be the one to tell
And
him.
I couldn't tell him. Like, I never told him what to do.
Wow.
So you have to be super careful about those things.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I deal with the same thing in the sense that I work with many of the companies and I do sponsored content. But I'm very smart about what I choose, what I say. I don't do exclusivity. I will, if I'm working with you as a company, I will talk about your product in the way I want to talk about it. I will be critical of it and compare it in an honest way, because that's what these companies are buying into. They're buying into the trust and authority that I have in the space. And if I were to ever lose that, then what's the point? I'm a
Mm-hmm.
sellout, right? So it's important for me to balance that all the time. And ultimately, I just want to get the information out about all of these things.
What you're talking about having integrity and being able to put the right barriers in place. This is when I was at Honeywell, I spent some time doing consulting engineering, going into different plants and implementing control. And you think about these are all huge competitors. One day I'm working on an Exxon refinery, and the next I'm working on a Shell, and the next a BP refinery, and you had to be super careful about compartmentalizing that. And this even plays into my current role as a small engineering consultant, where I've consulted for everybody in the diabetes space, all the companies, big and small. I've done work for them, and you have to be very careful to respect and protect their intellectual property and ability to compete.
Yeah. So with all of this Nightscout stuff going on and all of the things you're hearing that are possible, you've got Open APS, Loop, Android APS, all these automated systems popping up. Were you able to use all of that information and experience to push Medtronic to be faster and innovate in this area?
At every opportunity, I attempted to do that. Yes.
Was it hard?
Oh, incredibly hard.
As the chief
Incredibly hard.
engineer, it was hard.
Oh, yes. Oh,
And
very, very
why?
hard. Why was it
Is it
hard?
politics? Is it, you have all these people at the head of Medtronic that are setting what
There's some of
goals?
that. So there's business risk, there's commercial risk, there's intellectual property, patent thickets, there's the regulator. Do we really, it's going to cost this much money to do this thing. There might be other challenges that the business is facing that are higher priority, like warning letters or, other things at the FDA or product recalls. So, and I remember another little anecdote from my many times at the D-Data, Amy Tenderick's amazing conference. She once, I think she regularly does this, where she has a session where groups are put at tables and asked to innovate for a couple hours. Here's a thing, and then they would do this report out at the end of their 2-hour session. We discovered this thing, and I remember standing with a colleague at Medtronic as this readout was happening, and Amy was like, "That's amazing, that's a great thing." And I turned to my colleague and said, "Yeah, I got a spreadsheet back in the office with all of those ideas and 50 other ideas like them. That is not the problem. Like the ideation, the novel test tubes, that's not the problem. We got lots of novel test tube cool things. It's getting that through this commercial regulatory system so that it can scale is the hard part." Back to my chemical engineer versus chemist.
Then you would decide to make Nightscout open source. Anyone who wanted it could get it. You put it on GitHub. GitHub has 400 million repositories on there. You're one of them. And up until recently, you were the top 10 most forked. That's incredible.
Yeah, so 400 million repositories on GitHub, and it was in the top 10 most forked for a while. And incidentally, this scale, back to Howard Look and Brandon Arbiter, they were two of the first three people that I set up remotely after we had Nightscout working on here at home. So we had Android tablets all over the house and remote monitoring, and Howard and Brandon were number 2 and number 3.
Wow, that's so cool.
Well, and the other thing that happened is this now shone a light on the opportunity and that it's actually fairly low risk, right? Because you now got people who've just done this. And I would say this is really what led to Dexcom Share and Dexcom Follow and Libre Link Up. And now we do have some of that technology, or Tandem T-Connect, where we now today have an ability to do what only existed in the DIY Nightscout space 10, 12 years ago. I wrote the first install procedure for it, and you had to go do crazy things like installing MongoDB and Node.js and 3D printing a rig and getting an OTG kit, like all of these really difficult things that were a stretch even for engineers. And one of the things that happened is it got progressively easier. So that's where a lot of the later volunteer contributors to Nightscout just progressively made it easier. And today it's almost press a button and it does its thing.
Today's episode is sponsored by T1D Exchange. You can directly make an impact on diabetes healthcare, treatments, and technology by participating in the T1D Exchange registry. It starts with a simple survey about your life with T1D, and it only takes about 15 minutes. After that, you'll have a personal portal with ongoing T1D study and survey opportunities. Plus, some of these studies even offer compensation. Signing up with the link in the show notes helps support my channel, and it allows me to continue putting out free content. You can sign up at t1dexchange.org/diabetic or click that link in today's show notes. You would eventually leave Medtronic and co-found Bigfoot. Why was it time to leave Medtronic at that point?
I think it goes to the frustration about how slow things were going, that they had a pipeline and they were going to execute that pipeline. And meanwhile, my son is going through puberty and all the joy that brings and all the changes. And I just could look at the roadmap and see this is not moving quickly enough to meet his needs and other people's needs. So got together with Jeffrey Brewer and Brian Maslish, who also have sons with type 1 diabetes, and the 3D dads started this company called Nightscout, or Bigfoot.
And what year is it when this happens?
End of 2014.
At Bigfoot, you told me that you were able to build and test an automated insulin delivery algorithm in just 18 months. Whereas at Medtronic, it took 25 years.
Yes.
Why such the stark difference there, you think?
A couple things. One, Brian Maslish, who was a Wall Street quantitative trader at the time and developed algorithms for, he calls it scraping nickels out of the stock exchange. He scraped a lot of nickels out of the stock exchange. And he had built the first non-commercial ambulatory AID system in the world for his son and his wife, who's a doctor, who both have type 1. So we already had a system designed that we knew was working. This was years before Dana Lewis and Ben West and Pete Schwam and all the other, and partly because Brian is fairly well off. It was more difficult for him to expose. He wanted to give it away. So first of all, he wanted to just give this to everybody, but the FDA told him you can't do that, and there was some. So he didn't open source it.
And how did the FDA tell him? Like, he was in communication with the FDA?
He went down to DC and met with them. And this is something that you can read about online. He tells this story of he and his wife saying, here's this transformative technology that I'm using right now, and we'd like this to be broadly available. And the FDA said, well, as a class 3 device, you got to do it this other way. You can't just give it away. So that was one of the things that allowed us to move quickly, is we already knew what needed to be done. Now, what I would say is we knew what needed to be done in sort of a hacky way. So Brian's not a control engineer like me. So one of the things we did was translate his concepts into, that's a PID algorithm. Oh, that means that, there's a textbook over there which is describing the thing that you, independently came up with because you're a really smart guy. So it was this collaboration between Brian and I, with me with the background in engineering and medical devices. But another really important component to this is simulation. And I hope we talk about that a little bit, because that's what I'm
we're getting
now. But one of the first people we hired after the three of us started Bigfoot was a wonderful engineer, Ross Naylor, who worked with me at Medtronic. And I tasked Ross with building what we called the V Clinic, the virtual clinic, this simulation factory. So imagine a factory, and I said to Ross, build the factory. I'm not even going to tell you what we're going to make in the factory. Just build the factory first. I want you to be able to simulate physiology and behavior and CGMs and devices and all that stuff. Then when that V Clinic was done, we started building the algorithm. And the algorithm was the first thing that went through that factory. And it's almost like the algorithm just fell out of the effort. The effort was in the simulator, and the design of the algorithm is almost like the easy part. It wrote itself from the simulator.
And so you told me that this at Bigfoot, and while working on this is where you learned that simulation is or can be an important tool for getting medical technology reviewed for efficacy.
Well, and so absolutely. But again, back to my alien from the future idea, simulation was very common in this chemical plant control. And, I joke with people, welders and pipe fitters don't just show up in a farmer's field and start to build an oil refinery. They're simulating this. They're designing this using CAD and, fancy things. And when we were doing control of these chemical plants and refineries, we were using simulators. And you look at flight simulators. My favorite example is the first time a pilot flies an actual commercial, like my wife's on a jet right now. She's on a plane right now. Her pilot, the first time that pilot ever flew a plane was with passengers in it. Like, they don't let a pilot just go, do a check ride on a 737. They do everything in a simulator first. They've got high fidelity simulators. They use it for not just pilot training and certification, but, design of all sorts of different things. So this is another example of, I knew that simulation was a key enabler of doing rapid development of automation in these other domains. So I did the same thing at Medtronic, incidentally. I built a simulator there. That was the first thing I built when I was leading the commercialization of the predictive low glucose management algorithm. Because I was one of the founders, I got to determine how we were going to do engineering. And I said, we're going to be using simulation, we're going to be using automatic code generation, we're going to be using model-based design, we're going to be using all these things that these other industries are using, the tools and methods and processes, because we can and because they will work quite quickly. So I think that's another huge reason why we were able to move so quickly in the first 18 months and get into a clinical trial, starting from nothing, starting from founding the company to being in a clinical trial.
Were simulations not a common practice at this point in all of these pump and CGM companies? And why not? It sounds so obvious to me, but I'm coming from the outside.
I think this gets to this concept of evidence. So when you have a conversation with the FDA, they are extremely interested, as they should be, in, if we approve or clear this therapy, what's going to happen when there's 300,000 people using this? How do we give us evidence that your new therapy is safe and effective? And the way this evidence generation works, there's different levels of it. One level, the bottom level, is called bench testing, or a bench model. So an example might be, if you drop your insulin pump and it breaks and over-delivers insulin, right? That's a situation that could happen. Well, the way they test that is they put it in a test fixture on a lab bench and drop it. There's a procedure for doing that, and they say, we drop it from 1 meter, it'll be fine, and blah, blah, blah. The next level is called an animal model. So an animal model is, let's try this on a mouse or a beagle or a pig. So there's various animal models for predicting what might happen in human use. Then when you get through those levels, there's this concept of a feasibility study. So a feasibility study is with humans, but a small number of them in a very protected environment like a clinic. So my son, that example I gave of his trial where he's got that laptop, he was in a hospital bed for 3 days at Stanford with all sorts of other things connected to him and an IV and a full-time nurse and doctor watching over him. So that's what a feasibility study looks like. And it's typically 15 to 20 people for 2 or 3 days. Then when you've demonstrated, look, it's safe, it didn't have any adverse events in that situation, then you go to a pivotal trial. And the pivotal trial is nominally 90 subjects for 90 days, 90-90. It's now more like 180 because they want to do pediatrics at the same time. But the point is, simulation is an opportunity to sort of insert into this evidence generation scenario a way to predict what's going to happen before you put any humans at risk. And the FDA, to their credit, has been thinking about the role that computational modeling and simulation could play. How do we get, them into that concept into the pantheon of evidence generation? Because if you think about it, even a pivotal trial is a predictor of what's going to happen in the real world. So, even that is a model. And you get into things, and this is one of the things that really frustrates me. The people who show up for clinical trials are people like me and my wife who are very motivated and engaged. They're going to their endo. We've got any new trials coming in? And that introduces something called recruitment bias. So you are not generally seeing the broad swath of type 1 in these pivotal trials. You're seeing the really engaged folks. So when it goes to market, you might not see the same results, which is what we're seeing now.
Yeah, and a simulation could account for so many types of people from so many different backgrounds and learning levels and physical, different impairments in different people, right? These simulations 100%. Could have millions of types of people in the simulation, right? So it sounds just so much more powerful. And this is part of the work that you're focused on now, right? Is finding a way to make it so that simulation is an acceptable part of the review process, to speed up the review process, which takes so long. I mean, I've been doing this for 4 years, and the pace of which I'm talking about something and then it comes out, a new iPhone app to control a pump, 3 years, 2 years, like whatever it is, and I get a new iPhone every year. Well, I don't, but they come out with a new iPhone every year. So your new project, it's called the Automated Insulin Delivery Interoperability Framework. You're funded by the Helmsley Trust. This is to speed up that review process in diabetes tech, and potentially all medical tech. So correct me there if that's needed. What is the goal here? Let's start with that.
So let's drill into that acronym a bit. Automated insulin delivery, that's obvious. Interoperability. This is, I mentioned earlier that CGMs were originally class 3 devices, as were the algorithms. So the sense and decide components of the sense decide active closed loop, both of those were class 3. Paradoxically, the most dangerous thing, the insulin pump, which is actually delivering this potentially dangerous peptide, isn't class 3. But anyway, in 2018-19 timeframe, the FDA realized, wow, this is not moving very quickly using this class 3 pathway because it's moving at the speed of the slowest component to innovate. And, we'll just have done a bunch of effort to get the G4 integrated with the Animas pump, and then Dexcom comes out with the G5, and we have to start all over again, and we got a 3-year thing, which is what happened. And so sorry, you were going to say something?
No. Wow.
Yeah,
it almost disincentivizes the companies to innovate. Like Dexcom could have just been like, let's just slow down because, we have the time and Why bother?
Exactly. Exactly. So to their credit, and this was Stacy Beck, who's now at Dexcom, and her boss at the time, Courtney Elias, who's still at the FDA and doing amazing things. The two of them said, there's a better way. We need to figure out a better way to do this. Let's make things interoperable. So that's where the I comes from in AIDIF is recognizing that we now have these things called ICGMs, interoperable continuous glucose monitors. So that's what a G7 is, a G6, a Libre 3, a Libre 2, Senseonics. They're all ICGMs, and they're what's called Class 2. It's something like an order of magnitude less effort to bring a Class 2 device to market versus a Class 3 device. And so the algorithms, same way, IAGC algorithm. So Tidepool's algorithm is an IAGC, and that stands for Interoperable Automated Glycemic Controller. And then you've got these things called ACE pumps, which are alternate control-enabled pumps. So all of those are supposed to be plug and play. They're supposed to be, but they're not. And the problem is when you actually do connect these things together, sometimes you get surprises. So the reason I call it the AIDIF is to be able to simulate what's going to happen when you bring these devices together into a new sense decide act loop and characterize what's going to happen before the device might even be available. Because you can have a model for the device. So, I think the G7 is going to have this noise profile, and it's going to last this many days, and it's going to have these kind of non-physiologic behaviors of sensor compression out of it. Like, you can model all of that stuff before the device even exists, and then run that through a simulation to say, okay, is that going to make your algorithm happy or unhappy? What happens when you feed a noisy sensor into that? So this is really about de-risking, pulling risk forward, allowing characterization without recruitment bias to provide visibility into the expected safety and efficacy of combinations of devices well before they reach the market. And the FDA has said this, so this isn't me saying it. One day they hope to maybe even remove the need for clinical trials for some aspects of things. Like, if we're just making a change to an algorithm, do we really need to go through the 10-year pathway? And this is actually one of the challenges that we have right now. If you look at the algorithm my son uses, which he loves and is amazing, the Control IQ from Tandem, that algorithm was born in 2006. It went through puberty up around 2010. It went through its feasibility studies in 2012. It went through its pivotal in 2017. It got its clearance on December 16th, 2019. It became commercially available in early 2020. That's a 20-year-old algorithm. And
that's crazy.
It's still in Rev 1.
It's actually, there is Control IQ Plus, which just came out, at least in the US. Do you happen to know like the timing it took? Because it did bring some advanced new features.
It was a label expand. Yeah, I would say my sense of Control IQ Plus is it's a label expansion. So they went and studied it in a new cohort so they could change the label to say it includes peds or pediatric or whatever, and some minor challenge. Like, this is not a new algorithm.
No, it's not a new algorithm, but it did include the ability. Very powerful to me that they included was the ability to have temp basal within automation. So you could change your insulin delivery, how much you want during a certain time period, still in the loop, which is a big change. And these are changes I'd love to see come to, Omnipod has this new ability to put activity mode in this third option, and Medtronic just came out with this, we'll give microboluses every 3 minutes now, up to, whatever it is. These little minute upgrades are possible. It's all possible, but because of the current system, it's a lot of money. So to do these little things, probably they're disincentivized, I can imagine.
Yeah, and I think Beta Bionics is an example of this, where they relied on these feasibility studies to test different features, like set point changes. What happens if we want to create a set point down at 100 instead of 120? they would go do a clinical trial on that. And I think they've got 10 clinical trials of things like that, individual feature refinement through trial. At Bigfoot, we didn't do that. We did it all. We did it all in simulation and went for one feasibility of our entire algorithm, which was not just the closed loop model predictive control, but the layer above it on adaptation and the risk-based set points and the therapy individualization. And we did it all. We designed all of those features and capabilities and mode transitions, like you mentioned, about temp basal. All of that was done in simulation, and the algorithm didn't change after we did the feasibility study.
Yeah. The project states that the current system limits smaller companies because of the lack of resources to build and qualify their own simulators. Mm-hmm. How could this fix that?
Well, I think you interviewed John Sholin, and he made some mention of the role that simulation played in Luna's journey towards also moving extremely quickly to get to where they are today. And simulation played a big role in that. And what I mean by the big company, small company thing, the small companies barely have the resources to do the thing they're focused on, like making an insulin pump or making a new CGM. They generally don't have the skills and experience to build simulators. So this is the small niche that I've identified that I can help these companies by bringing simulation technology to them. There'll be simple things like, how big should we make the reservoir of a pump? Well, what's the model for how much insulin is used by people with type 1 diabetes? I've got all of that data. And what was frustrating to me is I've been doing this in consulting engineering now for about 5.5 years, and I'm doing it one company at a time. So, or two companies, I'll go help John at Luna, I'll go help somebody else, all these small companies, and that's not scaling. I'm built to scale and do these things chemical engineers do. And so this is why I came up with this idea, and I went to Helmsley and said, look, if we make this an FDA medical device development tool that has been qualified by the FDA, that is open and everybody can use, that will elevate the entire industry to be able to move quickly and essentially allow what Lane does to scale at an industry level without having Lane do one project at a time.
Wow, I'm all for it. Do big companies want this, or are they comfortable with the way things are now?
They also want it because they recognize that someday this is going to be the tool that the FDA has qualified. So a question would naturally emerge when somebody, a big company, goes forward with their latest iteration of an algorithm, and they say, look, we've got this thing that's good. The FDA might ask, how well does that work when you put it in this simulator, this AIDIF simulator?
Now, you plan to finish this by June 2027. Does that feel good to you right now? And what does it look like once that's finished? What are the processes that may need to happen next, and how long would they take?
Great question. So we're learning things. This pathway that we are have chosen, this FDA medical device development tool pathway, and you can Google this and learn about it. It's a relatively new and not heavily used. There's only 17 things that have ever been qualified through this, and only one of them relates to diabetes, which is the INSPIRE trial that Kath Barnard-Kelly did. So we are the first to do this for a simulator. We're the first to do this for what's called a physiologic closed-loop control context, AID. So we are breaking new ground, and we're learning things about the process as we go. But the short answer to your question is we feel completely comfortable about getting what we intend to accomplish done in the next 2 years. And the FDA, in some respects, has made it easier for us by encouraging us to chop it up into little bite-sized pieces and do it a piece at a time. So that's what we're doing right now. We got the first piece, and what we've done is lined up sponsors, medical device companies, to essentially be enabled by each of these individual bytes. So, sponsor number one is helping with byte number one because that's aligned with what they're trying to bring to market, and sponsor number two is aligned with. So it's coming together very nicely, and there's about 7 people helping me on the project now.
Well, and so let's say it does end in 2 years. How quickly does it go from, yeah, this is a thing and the FDA is cool with it, to companies using it?
This I think goes back to our DIY and open source roots, is understanding how do we get things to scale the way they did in, for example, the DIY Nightscout community. How did we get all these developers to start voluntarily contributing code? How did we get it to be the top 10 most forked repo in GitHub? How do we get all these? So we are going in with that mindset of, how do we create something that has a life of its own? Because incidentally, Helmsley Trust doesn't like to fund things forever. They like to give grants to get you up on your skis, but you need to do the skiing after that. So we're already thinking about, how do we make this sustainable? We really want many different people to be able to benefit and contribute to this. So the DIY community, academic researchers, the sponsors themselves, the sponsors being the medical device companies, the FDA. So how do we make, and it incidentally, I believe it all has to be open. There can't be any proprietary things here, because the most important thing about a simulator is how credible and trustworthy it is. And you can't trust a black box. This is part of the challenge that AI is having right now, is, where did it come up with that answer? And even the developers don't know where it came up with that answer. In this simulation framework they're building, there's no intellectual property. It's all open. There's no patents. Anybody can just look at it and reproduce it themselves, and use it and contribute to it.
What does the future of diabetes tech and innovation look like to you?
So I think actually it looks a lot like consumer tech. And if we take this for granted, and I'll touch a little bit on cybersecurity now. So when I first started working with Honeywell, Honeywell was kind of like the Medtronic of that industry. Everybody bought Medtronic. They were the gorilla in the industry, and they did everything. So it was vertically integrated. You bought everything from Honeywell. It was a proprietary system, very expensive. Nobody ever got fired for buying Honeywell. And then what happened is interoperability things started coming along. So people started to say, hey, we've got this new sensor technology that can connect into your control system using this open interoperable thing. And so that really, really threatened the incumbent, being Medtronic. So we had to embrace this notion of interoperability. But interoperability was also like opening Pandora's box a bit, because it created new problems as well. So now, because Honeywell made the decision, they were pushed by their customers to use Windows PCs as the operating system for their control. PCs were never designed to be turned on and run continuously for 4 years without a reboot. And that's what you need to do in an oil refinery. Like, you can't just reboot when Microsoft says, bad virus just found, you need to patch this vulnerability right now. So this is a huge, huge problem in the adoption of common commercial technology, which we've now figured out how to deal with, right? We figured out, well, you need to have virus scanners, and you need to do patching. And so this is what's now coming, and needs to come. I referred to it as interoperability a little while ago. What we have today is not actually interoperability. We have technical and commercial agreements between two parties like Dexcom and Sequel signing an agreement, and then going and doing an engineering project to integrate their two proprietary things. That is not interoperable like the USB or Bluetooth that we imagine. So this is the thing that I think is going to need to occur. The FDA knows about this. Paradoxically, this move from Class 3 AID systems to the separation into ICGM, IAGC, and ACE pump has reduced the amount of competition, not increased the amount of competition. So it's actually become harder. Look at poor Tide Pool, how long it took them to get their cleared algorithm onto an actual pump. If things were truly interoperable, then that could happen much faster. And we believe that one of the enablers of being able to interoperate these things more quickly is to be able to characterize their safety and effectiveness through simulation more quickly. And incidentally, you look at, how is it that Toyota and Ford and all these automotive companies can be cranking out new models with incredibly new capabilities every year with 40 computers doing all these things? What they do is they say to their new, vision camera, LiDAR, whatever partner, give us the model of your thing while you're still working on the thing, and we'll incorporate that into our simulator, and we can be co-developed. So that's what I mean about we're just taking advantage of these tools that others are using to accelerate their industry.
Yeah, and cars aren't insulin pumps, but they are keeping people alive or not keeping them alive.
Absolutely.
Right? These are dangerous vehicles that they could be.
I look at this as these are also safety critical systems that involve a lot of energy. I mean, we got potential and kinetic energy with cars and airplanes. We have biologic energy with insulin. But, these systems are used, there's a lot of energy, and anytime there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of potential harm. Nuclear plants are another example, or power plants.
Lane, thank you so much for coming on. This was a long one, but it was worth every single second. I learned so much, and I'm so looking forward to you continuing this work and following it. And as soon as there's something that needs to be reported on, please keep me in the loop. I'm sure I'll see the news stories or we'll make the news stories together, but I want to continue following this for everyone. So
thank you
I
so
appreciate
much.
it.
You're awesome. And thank you for everybody plays a role in this community, and you're playing such an important role by sharing what's going on in the community and disseminating that information. Thank you for you. It reminds me a little bit of these role-playing games where, you've got, priests and warriors and I'm just an engineer doing my thing. You're doing your thing, and it's all for the community.
Yeah, I'm the one with the camera filming it all and editing it all together and holding the mic to everyone.
And doing a great job at it. Thank you.
I really do hope that this future comes true, where smaller companies can innovate and push things through the funnel and cause more competition in the space, right? I think we all win there. All people with diabetes benefit when there are more people in the space. I mean, Lane said it himself from his experience. I hope you enjoyed the show. Lane, thank you so much for coming on the show. Now, if you have a story to tell or you have a suggestion on something we should talk about, someone we should talk to, head over to diabetic.info, go to the About page, and you can contact us from over there. I'm Justin, and I'll tech you later.